And next we have Brandi Spurling. Brandi and her husband, Chris, have called Columbia home for the last 10 years. She's been intrigued by the different perspectives she's experienced in a broad list of industries she's found herself in. So she let that inspire her master's degree in strategic leadership studies, where she focused on generational differences in the workplace before graduating in 2017. Now she's enjoying what a little curiosity, broad industry experience, and an ever-changing working world can do to help people work better together. Please welcome Brandy to our TED Talk stage.
Wow. I am so excited to be here. Honestly, this really is a very happy day in my life. But I will be honest with you, it does pale in comparison to one very specific day. It was a day that brought me so much joy, so much excitement. Honestly, everything changed for me on this day. It was the day that I received my 2005 LG flip phone. I know many of you probably were expecting me to say that it was my wedding day, right? But honestly, that was my favorite day, the happiest day. Top 5 included the LG flip phone, because that was my first cell phone. And maybe in the top 5 was probably the day that I went from streaming the internet on a very slow, bulky desktop computer and instead upgraded to a fancy new iPhone. Big days for me. The irony, though, of both of these days is that although we can believe that they would exist now because we're in them, if you would have even went 10 years before the first cell phone came out and told us that these were possible, we probably couldn't have believed you, because that wasn't the world that we were in. If you would have stopped me as I was waiting for that bulky desktop computer to grant me access to my 10 friends waiting for me on MSN Messenger, and you would have told me that day that not only would I have more than 10 friends, shout out to all 12 of them, but that someday I would also have access to all of them by the touch of a button in my pocket, I probably couldn't have believed you, because that was not the world that I was in. I did not know that world. That was unfathomable. And that's what happens in our world. It changes in ways that we can never imagine. And when we get to those futures that we previously deemed unfathomable in the first place, we're surprised and shocked that we ever thought that they were impossible. I would argue that we are in a similar moment of reimagining a world. But instead of reimagining a world that had photos that looked like this on our phones, can you believe we loved these? I took photos everywhere. Instead of photos like this and cell phones and Wi-Fi, I would argue it's our working world, our professional world, and the standards that we have been adhering to for so long. Because I would argue that work is not working for everyone right now. I started noticing this whenever I got into my research on generational differences in 2017. I saw it echoed whenever I found myself in a career in human resources for years. And I see it still as I'm working with leaders and companies from across the country. We have such a generationally diverse workplace that has 5 generations in it. 5 generations that all have their own unique perspectives, their own experiences, that were shaped by this world that grew them. And I am arguing that instead of seeing all of these beautiful new perspectives that are entering into our workforce with every new generation that joins us, that we find ourselves instead in this like Groundhog Day experience of being frustrated when we start to see individuals requesting that work fits into their life differently. We find ourselves in conflict whenever we see behaviors that don't match the ones that we have been used to for so long. We expect generations to know and value a world that looks like this when actually they've only known a world that looks like this the entire time. We expect them to have met George Jetson and his dog Elroy. I hate to break it to us friends, but less and less people know who this friend is. We expect them to know a world where our unfathomable future was video calls. That is their current world. Their unfathomable future looks so different than the one that we can imagine. And yet we ask them to join our workplaces and adhere to the values that have shaped all the generations before them. And those generations have built a workforce that didn't have them in mind in the first place. We ask Gen Zs to know the word respect in the same way that baby boomers knew it, which maybe meant that their bosses equaled authority figures, even though they were raised in a world that told them that their bosses could be their coaches or even their friends. We're surprised when millennials, shout out, leave their employers after 2 years, and then we call them job hoppers, even though maybe we fail to consider the fact that the world that they experienced was one where they saw their grandmas, after working 25 years for the same employer, get walked out of that employer in 2008 during the Great Recession and lose their job. I don't need a slide for that one. I don't need statistics for that one because that one was me. I am that millennial, and that was my grandma. And all of this matters because all of these new experiences and these new ways of looking at the world, they're not going to slow down because we are getting more and more new generations into the workplace every few years, it seems like. Right now, millennials and Gen Z are making up almost 50% of the workforce. And that number is just going to continue to grow every single year. And so my question is are we asking them to join a workforce and adhere to these values that weren't actually established with them in mind in the first place? Because that would be really hard. The odds of all of us having the same values is slim anyway. We can agree with that, right? Let me show you what I mean anyway. Let's just test it out. So if I have 50 values on this screen, and I asked every single person in this room to choose the 5 values up here that matter most to them in their professional world, what do you think the odds are that any 2 people in here would choose the exact same 5 values? Let me just tell you, it is slim. I did find the answer, and if I would have done it by the rules of my 5th grade teacher, I would have used a pen and a piece of paper because we are not going to be walking around with calculators in our pocket all the time. Yes, we are, Mrs. Roark. Yes, we are. Even if I wanted to do it with a pen and piece of paper, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think I could have. This turns out to be a very hard question to figure out. So much so that I didn't even use the calculator in my pocket. I actually used a fancy tool called ChatGPT. If you don't know what ChatGPT is, it is an AI tool that you can plug any question in, and it searches its little robot brain to find the answer for you. And it turns out that this question is even hard for a robot to figure out. But between the 2 of us, we came up with a very small number. The odds of 2 people in this room choosing the exact same 5 values is less than 1.6%. To put this into perspective, you have a higher chance of getting accepted into Harvard than choosing the same 5 values as someone else in this room. Calm down, like don't go submit your application to Harvard. Their acceptance rate is very low, it's 3%. And I did find that with my calculator and their website. We can't keep asking all of these generations to adhere and to value the same things in a workplace whenever it's so slim that that would ever be the case anyway. And not only that, even if they did value the same things, the odds that they would be measuring it by the same behaviors would also be very slim. Because values change and behaviors change. But it's not even the fact that they change that is the problem. It's the fact that we don't even get curious about them in the first place. We instead look at behaviors and let that be a determining factor, fill in the blank for us on what value that must mean based on our own experiences. For example, you have a new employee that joins a client meeting and they're wearing a beanie. Some generations might view that as disrespectful because the world that they were raised in equated respect to clothing. When Gen Z probably didn't grow up in that same world and they don't necessarily view respect in the same way. Or millennials taking all of their PTO, every single minute of it, because they value work-life balance. And if we come from a generation that didn't get that same opportunity or view it in the same way, maybe we fill in the blanks and say, oh, they must not be a team player. Because our previous version of teamwork was one in which there was self-sacrifice. And so if now millennials aren't self-sacrificing, we have the potential that people are filling in the blanks based on the world that we knew. And I would argue that's not entirely fair. We can't keep measuring all of these behaviors that we see based on our own viewpoints and filling in the blanks on the other side, because that's where we get conflict. And let me say, I'm guilty of it too. We're all guilty of it. But my argument is that we stop measuring behaviors at all. And instead we start having conversations about what might be the value underneath them. Because what if it just is that we simply value different things and we expect the world to look in a way in which matches those behaviors and values that we're looking through? That would mean that it would be all of us asking ourselves, what do we value? What do we value in the workplace? Because maybe the fact that we struggle with these new behaviors that come into the workplace and we see them join our workforces is actually rooted in the idea of fairness. If I had to experience this, they have to experience this. And I would argue if we don't do this, too long we're going to wait and we're going to have this version of the workplace whenever we could have had this one waiting for us much sooner than we were willing to accept it. But it all starts with us asking ourselves, what do we actually value? Do we even know? Or did we just inherit a world that was handed down to us without actually believing that we had room to dream up a new one that fit what we hoped to see in the world? And then whenever we do that, then we start asking, what do other people value? Because these two questions can start at the individual level. We don't have to wait for CEOs to create a world where all generations can see themselves represented in the systems, processes, and values of these organizations. It can start with us here, asking what do I value, asking what the other person values, and pausing whenever we lean into the inclination that we want to create story when we see behaviors that aren't familiar to us. Because if we all start doing this, then maybe on the other side, as individuals, as teachers, as parents, as family members, maybe if all of us start doing it, we see organizations that start evolving to match it. And now we have values and missions and systems that represent not only a couple of generations in the workplace, but instead represent all of them. That we can confidently say we have new ideas and perspectives coming in, and we're waiting to see what fresh ideas come. Because we're excited to include all the best parts of every generation, not just the one that has just felt comfortable for us for so long. Because I would argue, really, that just means us sitting at our dial-up computers, big, bulky dial-up computers, while we dream of a world that Wi-Fi is possible in the first place. Because when we do that, then we start including those unfathomable futures that everybody that's coming up behind us is already dreaming about. Because right now, work is not working for everyone. But that doesn't mean that it can't. Thank you.